The issue of riparian buffers or stream side setbacks, and we know that this is an important component of creating resilient habitats in our fisheries, as Jack had brought up. So it's something that we do need to be looking at in order to keep our waterways healthy and cold. Can you hear me okay? Okay. That I can't do, but I can speak into it better. How's that? I'm thrilled to have the panelists that we have, and I'm going to let our facilitator introduce those people. Let me make sure that Bruce, what did I do with your bio? Who doesn't know Bruce Farling? All right. Bruce has been the executive director of Montana Trout Unlimited for 15 years. Before working for TU, Bruce was conservation director for the Clark Fork Coalition for 5 years, which is a regional water quality advocacy organization based here in Missoula. Before that, he worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 10 years, the last 9 in wilderness management in Montana and Idaho. So really very grateful to have Bruce come and facilitate this. He's going to speak a little bit and then introduce our speakers. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, and then we will have question and answer. So if you have questions for the speakers, if you'd be kind enough to hold the questions till the end, we have designated a pretty long spot at the end there for all of your questions. So Bruce?
Thanks, Bob, and thanks everybody for coming out Saturday to listen to some pretty interesting topics. Commercial break. On the back tables of publication we put out, Trout Unlimited, Montana Trout Unlimited, the Natural Resource Defense Council, that addresses a lot of the topics that Jack was talking about previously relative to the effects of climate change on fish. Slightly different twist with our publication. There's a lot of this stuff out right now. The twist in this one is what we are trying to do is pose some questions and get people to think about not what climate change means for fish, but also what climate change means for the cultural values and economic values that we derive from fish. Because it's our belief that in order for us to get the support, critical mass we're going to need to essentially tackle what is the challenge of our time, is we're going to have to get people to understand how it affects them. And so there's a bunch of copies back there. If you pick it up, and hopefully you'll find some helpful information that'll illuminate some of the stuff Jack was talking about. I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists, and then Bob has asked me to sort of take a few minutes and set the stage for the topic of riparian corridor buffers and protections, setbacks, etc. Our first speaker is we're going to go in this order, Brianna Randall, and Brianna is, can't hear me, okay. Brianna's Water Policy Director of the Clark Fork Coalition, has been since 2007. Previous to that, she worked for 3 years for the Montana Water Trust, which is an organization works on a volunteer basis, working with water rights owners in the state to figure out a way to essentially use the market to get them to convert their water rights to in-stream flows. Brianna has a master's from here at the university in environmental studies. Our second speaker is going to be Karen Miskey. Karen is the executive director of the Flathead Basin Coalition, or Flathead Basin Commission, which is a quasi-public-private body that has been extremely helpful in protecting this wonderful gem that we have north of us, Flathead Lake, and the tributaries that of Flathead that are so important to the custom and culture of us in western Montana. Karen was previously a private attorney in private practice working on land use. And then our third speaker is going to be our new Missoula County Commissioner, Michelle Landquist, and abbreviate her biography. She's from Minnesota. She is a sheep farmer from Lolo. She's now our commissioner. And Michelle actually, I think, probably knows a lot about this topic because she's been heavily involved as a principal in the Lolo Watershed Committee, which is trying to figure out ways to improve the quality, the fishery of Lolo Creek, which is indeed one of the largest, probably one of the most modified large streams we have in the state of Montana. But before those guys speak. Like I said, Bob asked me to set the stage a little bit here. If you'll indulge me a little bit here, let me 3 short stories for you. Back about 7 or 8 years ago, Dr. Jack Stanford, who runs Yellow Bay Research Station for UM up at Flathead, and is really one of the world's foremost ecosystem scientists, Jack's specialty being studying the interchange of groundwater, surface water, and floodplains, and how they interact to produce essentially biological communities that we have in rivers. One of Jack's, some of you guys may know him, he's a really great guy. One of Jack's primary study areas is in Kamchatka. And he's been going over there and looking at floodplain processes with rivers and how it produces what are the most productive salmon, trout, and char populations anywhere in the world. And Jack gave a presentation in my local chapter up in the Flathead, and he had these wonderful oblique photos from these old Russian creaky helicopters looking down on these rivers in Kamchatka that hadn't been developed a lot, although people have been living there for thousands of years. And I was just stunned by looking at it, because there was one particular river, giant river the size of the Clark Fork or larger, same type of river type, meandering. A lot of the energy is essentially expended in creating new meanders, much like the Bitterroot, much like the Yellowstone. Not a lot of gradient to the stream. Most of the energy goes sideways, moves laterally. How when you look down that river, the whole meander belt was vegetated and essentially unimpaired by people, and actually beyond the meander belt. And that's the belt, if you look at how a river goes like this, that would be the belt like that, but also beyond, outside the floodplain, outside the flood fringe, and where the people in this rural area in Kamchatka were living and cultivating and building their homes was up on benches above the river. And I asked Jack, geez, it's probably what the Flathead looked like 200 years ago, probably what the Bitterroot looked like and the Yellowstone. I said, why aren't, these people are poor, why aren't they like squeezing up against the river to try and squeeze a few more nickels out of it by planting crops there or or building homes there or whatever? And he goes, well, essentially is that they understand the power of a river. And they knew that if they built any closer than that, their houses were going to get knocked down, they were going to lose their crops. But they also recognized the value, the natural value in that healthy river corridor and what it meant to both their way of life and both their economic well-being. And that's what was maintaining this wonderfully robust fishery. I said, oh, okay, well, if they can do it in Kamchatka, surely we can do it over here. Story number 2. 2002, over in the Big Hole, was the year that the 3 counties that encompass the Big Hole River enacted streamside setback ordinance, fairly modest, but it's a pretty good start, about 150 feet for new development from the river. You couldn't develop. You also had to protect your vegetative buffer. These are Beaverhead County, Deer Lodge County, and Beaverhead, Deer Lodge, and Silverbow. And at least a couple of those are very conservative counties. A lot of private landowners, a lot of private property rights concerns and stuff like that. But they thought it was really important to do this. Right before this ordinance went into force, upstream of Wise River, on the river, a landowner said, well, I gotta build something here. And they went right into that setback area right next to the river, laid down a cement pad for a very large home and a foundation. In fact, this pad is so big, if you put a basketball hoop over here, a basketball hoop there, the Celtics could probably play at the Knicks. So that winter, the pad was there. They were going to put the house up there the next year. That winter, as happens in that reach of the Big Hole, it froze. The ice built up, caved up on top of each other. The ice came over, and it carved out a good portion of this pad and kind of destroyed it. A few weeks later, the river thawed a little bit. Water backed up behind the ice dam, and then water flooded the pad and finished the job. So what the landowner did the next year, rebuilt the pad in the same spot. And then on top of that, the landowner started building the house again. And it's this huge log structure was built. That winter, workers went away apparently one day, and somehow this thing caught on fire. And of course, being the Big Hole, being the river, being it was icy, it was snowed in, local rural fire folks couldn't get down there, the place burnt to the ground. What happened the next year? The landowner built the house back. And you can see it there today. Point being is that the difference between Kamchatka and the Big Hole is, or Kamchatka, they didn't have FEMA, they didn't have the Bureau of Reclamation, didn't have the Army Corps of Engineers, didn't have local government, didn't have local taxpayers to bail you out. this, or taxpayer subsidized flood insurance. On the Big Hole, nature was telling landowners, you shouldn't be building here, but they still did. Third and last story, many of you remember 1996, the winter of 96, and the winter of 1997 over in the Yellowstone where we had a 100-year flood event. There is a place I've been seeing for years. It was an old resort house between Emigrant and between Livingston. It was on a cut bank, highly erosive cut bank for years, on an outside bend of the Yellowstone River. And they had dumped a whole bunch of rock riprap to armor the bank to protect it from so-called floods and stuff. Well, we had a 100-year event, came through there, all of that riprap got washed out, moved downriver, ended up in the river, the house fell into the river. Okay, the guy lost the house, but what happened is that what that riprap did then in turn is it steered the force of the Yellowstone River at 40,000 CFS, the main thowwag of the river. That would be, to geomorphologists, the deepest, fastest, swiftest, most erosive part of the river, over to the west, over to a ranch on the other side where there's the famous Armstrong Spring Creek. Well, if you're a fisherman, you've heard of Armstrong Spring Creek. It's very famous. People come from all over the world to fish it. And what it did is it captured the Spring Creek and made the Spring Creek part of the river. And essentially there was no upper Spring Creek anymore. And it created an island there. And so that landowner goes, well, I make some money out of this. It's a local conservative, very well-known family over in the Paradise Valley. And they went and they got permits and stuff and didn't get some permits from the Army Corps, et cetera. I mean, they rip-wrapped the bank when the river went down and then reconstructed the old, Spring Creek channel where the river had captured it for the next year. Next year, we had a similar near 100-year flood, and all the locals are going, how can we have this 2 years in a row? We had one last year, we're not going to get one for 99 more years, right? That's not how flood probability works. And so anyway, the Spring Creek was threatened again. The landowner said, screw the permits, I'm going in there with a lot of rock, and he put a whole bunch of rock in there, and he put a levee in there. And what that did was it protected the Spring Creek, but it pushed the river over to the east bank of the Yellowstone, to the landowner over there. And over there, there's the famous Nelson Spring Creek, which is another Spring Creek that's a rod fee. They make a lot of money on it. And that guy got worried. So what he did was he rip-wrapped the heck out of his bank, put what is now called the Great Wall of the Yellowstone. If you float that section of the Yellowstone, you can't miss it. And now the river's going to be pushed over to the west. The point being is that when you want to have development next to a very active river, you can put things in there to try and steer it to one way or the other. Eventually, it isn't necessarily going to help you or protect you, but it can also, not besides the harmful effects it has for aquatic communities and for river function, it also can harm somebody else's private property rights. And so that's one of the points that my organization, Brianna's organization, other organizations are trying to make when we work with local government and the legislature, encouraging them to think about creating some incentives, primarily regulatory, until people want to do it genuinely in a voluntary fashion, which has never really worked in the state, to promote development away from rivers. What rivers need to do is they need to expend energy. They expend it laterally. They occasionally spend it vertically. They need to build and use floodplains, and they need to erode naturally, and they need to deposit material naturally. And all those processes really get screwed up when we build next to a river and we try and armor them with like the rock riprap and the levees we used on the Yellowstone, with what these people in the Big Hole are probably going to end up doing to protect their place in the future. All those processes, people like Jack Stanford and other really prominent scientists, fisheries professionals who I work with, determine we need, if we're going to maintain the resources, some of the things that Jack Tucholsky talked about, our wild trout resource in Montana, which generates about $300 million a year annually to our state. And so, point is, I want to make here is that the idea of river corridor protection is something we really need to tackle in Montana, need to tackle on a statewide basis, need to be consistent about it. And it's not only we need to do it for fish, but we also need to do it for economic reasons. We also need to do it to protect private property rights. With that, I'd like to let Brianna sort of go ahead and speak.
Thanks, Bruce. He basically gave my presentation, so you guys don't need to even pay attention. So, quickly, another publication that's out, Low Flow's Hot Trout, is the Clark Fork Coalition's climate change report. We released it in July, and rather than focusing specifically on trout like TU's recent publication, this one is a basin-wide look at the science on whether or not our watershed is warming and the actions and policies behind what we can do to keep our watershed how we like it. So there's a ton of copies here if you'd like them. And I also have our recently produced Streamside Facts on Setbacks brochure if you guys want a little cheat sheet after I'm done talking. So the Clark Fork Coalition, it's been around since 1985, and for the last 5 years or so, we've been looking at how to best protect our riparian areas. They're pretty critical. They are what drive, as Bruce said, our communities, our economies, why we live here. But the problem is we love them to death. And unlike in Kamchatka, as Bruce was saying, a lot of people move to Montana and haven't been around the rivers and streams for a long time. They move here and they say, gosh, there's beautiful. Look there's Rattlesnake Creek. I want to live right next to Rattlesnake Creek. But not having been from Montana or familiar with the power of our rivers and streams, they don't realize exactly why it's a bad idea to riprap, as Bruce was talking about, or why it might be a bad idea to literally live on top of the streams. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the general why we need them and what they can be, what types of streamside protections we're looking at, not just setbacks, the dreaded S word that people hear a lot. In a little bit, I'll talk about the statewide policies and let Karen and Michelle go more into the countywide dynamics. So what setbacks are basically buffers. They protect our streams and rivers. Streamside setbacks specifically, when we usually talk about that term, we're talking about setbacks for new development. So new structures, new roads, anything that's really going to cut into our riparian area. They are buffers, literally. Some of these pictures here are of the Bitterroot. This last year, we had what people thought were big flood events in the Bitterroot and in the Gallatin. And you can see this whole area on the Bitterroot flooded out, and that's what a floodplain is supposed to do. The reason we want to protect our riparian areas is because they're supposed to flood, and a river is more than just that lovely channel we see. It moves a lot. It has the room to roam, as the governor's office has been talking about for the last year, and I'll get into that more. But as you can see, this fall picture here is the Clark Fork just out by Blue Mountain, and look at all those channels and braids. If we start putting houses there or roads or other structures, it really suffocates our rivers. So the Bitterroot River this May, here's some pictures. You can see the house. There, they didn't fare so well. This was in Darby, it was a 5-year flood event in May, and it was a 2-year flood event in Florence, and that's how many homes just in these two pictures were impacted by the floods. In the Gallatin, this East Gallatin there is that big curvy river, again showing the lateral movement that these rivers like to have. There were 170 homes that reported flood damage. It was an 8-year flood event on the East Gallatin. So not even a 100-year flood event like Bruce was talking about on the Yellowstone. So again, it's really illustrating the need that though our riparian corridors are very fragile, it's not just about the fish and the wildlife. It's about our homes, and it's about protecting where we live and our what we treasure about Montana, our homes and that resource there. So this is an illustration of one of the stories that Bruce was just talking about. Here's a foundation on the big hole after an ice jam came by. I imagine it's the same exact house. And it just scoured it right off. Rattlesnake Creek, I don't know how many of you guys saw some of these photos, but when a bunch of the ice built up during the Arctic freeze last month, there were some great photos that the ice broke and the Rattlesnake Creek got super high. It pushed into the Clark Fork so hard that the ice jammed up on the opposite bank there by the river trail. So even though we often think about, our flood season in Montana is spring, May and June, the ice jams are important too. And The rivers change every single day. So it's really important to know that these riparian protections are not just for a 1 or 2 week event when the runoff happens. So why else are they important for our water? They protect native riparian vegetation, and the Clark Fork Coalition's been really trying to get this message home, that it's not about setbacks, it's not just about telling people where to build the houses, it's really about getting the knowledge out there that these plants, these willows and cottonwoods and everything that grows on our stream banks, they protect the water we drink and the wildlife we treasure. They slow that flood flow. So just like maybe 20 years ago, people didn't know that seat belts were really important. And now, pretty much, hopefully, a lot of people just automatically put their seatbelts on. It's the same way with protecting our riparian vegetation. Really need to make sure that it isn't in the best interest of the property owner or the habitat to clear cut this vegetation. It might look ugly sometimes, or you might not like that red color in the fall, but it serves a purpose beyond just what it looks like. Again, Karen's going to talk about this, but our riparian areas are only 2 to 4%. That's it. Of our entire landscape. But they provide habitat for 80 to 90% of the wildlife species. 90% of our wildlife species depend on riparian corridors for some portion of their life. And it's such a small chunk of land, which is why it's doubly important to protect it. Here's an instance of, again, that riparian vegetation. This is a classic problem. You move to a river or stream, you love your house, you want to plant your native Kentucky bluegrass that you had wherever you last lived, and you take out those willows and cottonwoods, the banks crumble. It adds sediment into the rivers and streams. That's bad for the fish. It's bad for water quality. You can't get those good bugs, and it just sort of snowball effect, not a cannonball, but a snowball effect, where it just keeps on crumbling without any roots to support that good dirt. And then you have a house, and it falls in the river. So that's on the Clark Fork, and they actually had to burn that house. I didn't put the house on fire picture in there, but they had to light it on fire because it was about to fall in. Another way to deal with that is the bottom picture. This is on, again, I think that's the east fork of the Bitterroot. Is that right? Yeah. And it's all riprap there, the big concrete blocks. A lot of landowners put the riprap in, which basically speeds up the velocity of that river. Instead of being able to spread out into the riparian vegetation in the floodplain, it gets channelized and it just speeds up, and your downstream neighbor gets their bank eaten away. So another snowball effect. The Clark Fork Coalition's been, we did a survey last year of some of the biggest threats facing the Clark Fork watershed, which is basically the whole third of western Montana. And it used to be a lot of mining and resource extraction related threats, and 90% of our responses to this survey were growth is the new threat to, the biggest threat to the Clark Fork watershed. And it's not, we need to grow. Everyone recognizes this, but how do we grow well so that we aren't cutting up our rivers and our habitats and the communities that we enjoy about this watershed? So again, this is all rip-wrapped. This is down by the Big Flat, and one house, maybe not such a big deal, but you get a row of houses, and you can see here, this is exactly how the river wants to move. The cottonwoods on the left there, those are the bands that naturally the river would progress to the right and to the right and create more cottonwood bands, and now it's stuck because of the riprap, and those homes need to be protected because they built them there. And again, you can see the lack of riparian vegetation there on the side, so that just adds to the problem of the river speeding up and moving downstream. So looking at growth rates, this is a Sonoran Institute projection. You can see those red dots. Those were all the structures present in 2005. That's Missoula County outline. And you can see them grow. And where are they growing? On our river and stream corridors. Because it's a beautiful place to live, of course, but it's also some of the only private land in our county. We have a lot of public land. And so we see that growth is going to happen and be focused on our river corridors. So we need to make sure that we, again, how do we protect them as we grow? This is consistent throughout the watershed. Our growth rates on average were about 10% in western Montana in the 10 counties in the Clark Fork watershed. 26,000 more people moved here between 2000 and 2007. Might be slowing a bit with the economic downturn, but again, it's not going to stop. So we need to figure out how to best protect it. Again, looking at where people build, A lot of people put in wells here with their homes, especially if they're in rural reaches. So those wells, 40% of the wells in the Clark Fork watershed were installed since 1990. So that's a lot of wells, 58,000 total wells. And then over half of the 58,000 wells were within 1 mile of a stream. And that really tells you where people are building again. And with those wells often come septic systems, because again, you're in the rural reaches, you're not being able to hook up to sewer. So it shows where and why we want to grow. In those septic systems, you cannot put a septic system within 100 feet of a waterway. The Department of Environmental Quality has that permit. However, even 100 feet is pretty close, and we just want to be sure we don't have a lot of nutrients, the nitrates and phosphates from our wastewater systems seeping into the waterways. So in addition to that erosion issue, we also get nutrient and wastewater issues in our rivers and streams. So really quickly, why would we need more? Why don't we have existing regulations? Why isn't this problem already fixed if we love our rivers and streams and people know that the science backs up why we need to protect our corridors? Well, we have a few. We have 310 laws, but those are conservation district, county enacted, and that just means you have to get a permit for any action in a river in the bed and banks of a stream, not beyond the banks of a stream. There are city regulations in Missoula, for instance, and there are some counties that have subdivision regulations, and we'll talk more about that. And a lot of people say, well, you can't build in a floodplain, right? The problem is FEMA mapped rivers are very few and far between. We don't have FEMA maps, for instance, on Rattlesnake Creek, which could flood. We don't have any floodplain maps on several reaches of our big rivers. So while the Clark Fork, for instance, is FEMA mapped, that doesn't mean all of our rivers and streams are. It also doesn't show the issues, it only shows the elevation issues. So for instance, that house, I don't have the picture of it. If a house is 10 feet off the river on a bank, which often happens in the Yellowstone, so vertical slope, it's out of the floodplain. But you can still build right on that slope. And as we know, the river's gonna still eat away at that slope, and the house could still fall in, or it still has negative impacts on the river's room to roam. I'm gonna skip this because I think other folks are gonna talk about the county issues. I don't know how much time I have. Bob? Am I okay? I'll talk a little bit, well, first let me talk about the state, and then we'll go back to counties. So the state has, again, as Bruce said, this is an issue that needs to be addressed in Montana as a whole, partly because these big rivers cross several county jurisdictions. So while Missoula County and Ravalli County might be really cooperative, or the best case scenario right now, Big Hole has a 4-county agreement for this 150-foot setback from the Big Hole River. That doesn't mean that every county can do it that way. So the Clark Fork crosses, again, 10 counties. That's a lot of counties. How do we make sure that it's a fair and that the state is taking responsibility for the flood damage, that all the counties are equally responsible for protecting this resource? So the last 3 legislative sessions, this will be the 3rd, I suppose, 2005, 2007, and then in 2009, the state has seen legislation based on streamside setbacks or buffers. It failed in 2005 and 2007. There's another legislative act up. There's actually a couple with different numbers. Just 1 second, I'll get to that. The one that sort of has a conservation community behind it is called the Big Sky Rivers Act. It would protect the Big 10 Montana rivers that, again, cross jurisdictional boundaries. It has a stream management area set, and it would let the counties implement that streamside management area. The governor's office has been supportive of, again, protecting these riparian areas that are a small but important portion of the Montana's landscape, and they have a Room to Roam program. The governor's riparian task force has produced a home builder's little pamphlet on what best to do and how to build, but there aren't any statewide policies in place right now. The Clark Fork Coalition, that's our web page there. We're trying to work in the counties in our watershed, specifically in Missoula County, to work with the different stakeholders. For instance, I've presented to the Missoula Board of Realtors and a few different groups here to say, what do you guys want? What do you need? What do you see as important? Some people want to protect the public health and safety. Some people want to protect view sheds. Some people want to protect trout. How do we mesh all of this and make sure that our waters are protected fairly and with buy-in for everyone else. Okay. So there's a few different approaches we're looking at. The setback approach can have a hybrid approach of looking at different maps. Right, the Missoula City ordinance right now has a riparian resource protection area, so any new building within one of these riparian resource areas has to go look at the map and have a management plan for how they're going to deal with the riparian resource. Like, it's not a line on the map that says you have to build 50 or 100 feet. It's a variable approach. So we're researching different options. I was looking at Idaho, a couple cities in Idaho that have permits specifically. Developers get certified for a riparian-friendly lot that they're building. So there's a lot of different options. It doesn't just have to be that line on the map that often is controversial. My picture didn't work. So just to cap there, as Bruce said, and we just want to drive home, the message the Clark Fork Coalition is really trying to get through with billboards, and we have a stream care guide coming out for landowners, just to again, for more education to people. Fasten your seatbelts, protect the stream corridors, because it helps your private property, it helps our water quality, and it provides recreational and economic benefits for the entire community that depend on these rivers. They're ribbons of life. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up there, and we're gonna wait on questions. So write them all down. You can throw tomatoes at me after you hear from the other two.
Good afternoon, everybody. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm here on behalf of Hal Harper, so I know I have some big shoes to fill, so I will do my very best. For those of you who are not familiar with the Flathead Basin Commission, the Basin Commission was created by statute in 1983, and the mission of the organization is to protect the waters flowing into and out of the Flathead Basin, as well as protect other natural resources in the basin. The basin has been primarily focused a great deal historically on much of the transboundary work that we do, which is protecting the basin from the threats that have been pending over the last 25 years in British Columbia. But we've been increasingly focusing on a lot of the domestic issues facing the basin and water quality in the basin. I'd just like to start out with a couple of facts, and Brianna, I think, did a great job in laying the groundwork. One of I think the most important facts to remember is that either 2 to 4 or 1 to 5% of our landscape actually consists of wetlands and riparian corridors. And when you think about that, it's a very tiny fraction of the landscape that we have traditionally given very short shrift to. So this unique ecosystem is in greater need of protection now than it ever has been, with all of the pressure related to development. The second thing is that these landscapes are also more productive in terms of biomass than any of the upland terrestrial ecosystems are. And then the third point is that these are really the critical source of biodiversity. 80 to 90% of wildlife species, and birds I know in particular, but all wildlife species, are dependent on these riparian corridors for either habitat for their entire life cycle, for nesting, for forage. So it is really important, if we want to preserve the species on the landscape, to protect these corridors. And there are some really sobering facts. And I just bring these up because I think there's a very unique and small, relatively small window that we have here in Montana if we don't want to go the way of California and a whole bunch of other states. But from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, the US lost 2.6 million acres of wetlands. That's 4,000 square miles of wetlands in a 10-year period. On average, the lower 48 has lost more than 60 acres of wetlands for each hour that's passed between 1780 and 1980. So the rate at which we're losing this off the landscape is astronomical. When you look from a statewide perspective, the losses have been incredibly staggering. And the data I'm using is a little bit dated, so these numbers are probably actually higher today than they were a couple of years ago. California has lost 91% of its riparian corridors and wetlands. Ohio has lost 90%. Iowa, 89%. Indiana and Missouri have both lost 87%. The Prairie Pothole region, which is basically the duck factory for both the US and Canada, has lost 65%. This is the ecosystem upon which waterfowl production is dependent, and we've cut it in more than half. At Florida Everglades, 50%. So here in Montana, we're not at these numbers. We're not at 90%. We still have a window at which we can do something. But this requires political will, and it requires the will of the people to really get up and say, this is important, we want change, and we want this protected. We want to do something about this. It's kind of interesting right now in this economic downturn. We hear so much bad news every day. But there is a silver lining in the economic downturn, and part of that is that the pressure, the development pressure, which was overbearing even 2 or 3 years ago, has now kind of quieted. And because it's quieted a little bit, we have a unique opportunity right now to step up and do some things which I think might have been very hard to do even a year ago. So we are presented with a unique opportunity to try to get setbacks at the state level as well as at the local level. The benefits of the riparian corridors, I think, again, Brianna went over very well. Water quality benefits. Riparian corridors can assist in removing pollutants, and there's an actual ecological services function that goes along with that. If, in fact, we had to pay to filter that water, what it would cost, and there are many states around the country who do, in fact, pay to filter their water. So it's not simply a water quality issue per se, it's also very much an economic issue in terms of the economic value that those corridors provide to us. There's also a water quality benefit in terms of maintaining temperature and protecting the fisheries, and I know Jack talked about that quite a bit. There's also a water quality benefit in terms of reducing evapotranspiration and keeping streams deep so that, again, we can keep temperature at the level that the fisheries need. Protects wildlife, and also has an important flood control. I think Bruce's stories illustrate, has a very important flood control benefit. It also protects developers' interests. In Flathead County, there has been a great push, as many of you may know, historically, against land use controls, against zoning in particular. And I don't know if any of you saw it in the paper probably 6 months ago or so, but it showed a condo about 3 feet underwater. And the developer, of course, there were no regulations, and the developer had built right on the lake shore of Flathead Lake, and in fact the condo was underwater. So it would in fact protect developers' interests as well as the private property owners who ultimately buy a lot of these homes and condos. One of the claims that I hear quite often is that, well, this will devalue my property if we have setbacks. Well, if you look around the country, and there have been numerous studies done on this, it does not in fact devalue property. One of the very interesting things in some of the areas where you have in fact the highest property values in the country, you also have fairly stringent land use regulations. So the argument that this devalues property simply, no pun intended, does not hold water. It also protects the tourism industry. Tourism in Flathead County in particular is the prime economic generator for the county. If in fact water quality declines, recreation declines, the fishery declines, that impacts the economic bottom line for the county, and that's true for many areas in the state which are increasingly dependent on the tourism trade. So what do all of these facts and figures mean? I think what it means is that we can no longer treat riparian areas as throwaway zones. Brianna said, why isn't this fixed? And I think in large part it's not fixed because this is probably one of the classic tragedy of the commons. Bruce alluded to the fact that one person ripraps, well, then the next person ripraps, and then the next person ripraps. Pretty soon you have a river channel that's armored from head to foot. Well, everyone only riprapped their own little section, and they were only taking care of their own little piece of their own property. But the river suffers. Hydrologic function goes out the window because with all that riprapping, essentially, you no longer have the exchange that you need for those aquatic communities. So I think it's really important that we think about this on a statewide basis as well as on a local basis because of the fact that this does cross county lines, and that the costs and the benefits should be borne equally by everyone in all fairness. So, this is not a novel idea, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk to you about next. The Flathead Lake Biological Station has done some studies, and they've found that a 300-foot setback is pretty much the minimum required to protect water quality and wildlife. Some wildlife species need quite a bit larger setback than that, but 300 feet is the minimum. EPA collated studies across the country, put it into one document. Pretty much the same results. We're looking at a minimum of 300-foot setbacks required to protect the resource. That being said, one of the things, and I'll kind of have a little bit of an awkward segue here, that's all the background in terms of riparian corridors, why they're important, and what's out there. I want to now segue into what the Basin Commission kind of has done regarding this issue of riparian corridors and where we've gone with it and what some of the problems and challenges have been. When I first came on board 2.5 years ago, there was a lot of talk at the Basin Commission about wanting to have this major land use and large lakes conference. And I had some reservations. There are groups just like this who do conferences all the time, and I thought, well, we don't necessarily need to do this. There are folks who specialize in doing these conferences. But one of the things that convinced me ultimately was that we would take the recommendations from the conference and actually try to implement them on the ground. So we had our Large Lakes Conference, and one of the discussions at that conference had to do in particular with riparian corridors. The folks from the Big Hole came over and talked to us. They were one of the folks on a panel related specifically to riparian corridors. And that 4-county area, it's the Beaverhead, Deer Lodge, Madison, and Silverbow, was the first really to do a multi-county setback ordinance of 150 feet. And I can get into that more in terms of the specifics and some of the challenges that they've had implementing that setback ordinance. But as a result of our discussion at the Large Lakes Conference and some of the direction that was given to us post-conference in follow-up workshops is that the Basin Commission decided we would work with Flathead County and try to implement setbacks. This is not as easy as it sounds. For those of you who are familiar with the politics in Flathead County, it is a very difficult place to conduct that type of business. But what we really did try to do is we really tried to work not just with the county commissioners, but we tried to work with a whole key group of stakeholders. So we worked with folks from the realtor community, we worked with folks from the ag community, we worked with folks from the environmental community. And we tried to not just educate, but really get to the bottom line, realtors in particular, ag folks in particular. There's a bottom line in terms of there are some very good, solid economic reasons as to why setbacks are important. That being said, some people were supportive and some people were not supportive. We also tried to work with the counties to educate them as to what else was out there. Flathead County, again, was kind of coming to this with a clean slate, so to speak, in terms of they didn't have anything on the books. Gallatin County, which is one of the examples that we used for the Flathead, has a 100-foot, they have a 300-foot setback in Gallatin, West Gallatin, Madison, Jefferson, and Missouri, and they have a 150-foot setback on all other water courses. Similarly, Lewis and Clark County also have setbacks, and they break it out into 4 different types, and their setbacks range anywhere from about 250 feet down to 100 feet. So we tried to kind of educate the county on what was out there. And long and short of it was that the county did, in fact, implement a riparian corridor setback regulation under the subdivision rules. It wasn't what any of us, I don't think, expected. And I want to read you the language because it's kind of interesting language. What they implemented was a riparian, that each subdivision has to submit a riparian protection zone. And the plan shall demonstrate that the proposed subdivision will not involve unnecessary environmental degradation. I can tell you that developers weren't all that happy with that either, neither were we. It leaves the door open to perpetual litigation. For two, it is incredibly subjective as to what that phrase means. So what we have right now in the county is something that none of us are really sure how it's going to work on the ground. Some of the other pitfalls associated with that is that there are exceptions to this rule. In the riparian plan, essentially, all native vegetation is supposed to be left intact, and there's supposed to be no new structures built. However, there are a bunch of exceptions to that rule. There's an exception for recreational structures, which would be docks and ramps and all of the other stuff that go along with that. There's an exception for stream bank stabilization, which means that you can riprap. There's an exception for the replacement of existing septic systems. This one is of particular concern. The Flathead Basin Commission was actually going to be starting our groundwater study in the shallow aquifer. The impacts of those septic systems on Flathead Lake from our limited research so far indicates that there is a significant impact. To be allowing the replacement of these septic systems seems to kind of contradict everyone's efforts to improve water quality in Flathead Lake, which has been steadily declining over the years, as well as allowing for stream crossings, so in limited circumstances. So it's kind of interesting that we did in fact get streamside setbacks, but it was not what we thought it was going to be. And there, with no numeric standard in place, I think this really cuts both ways. On the one hand, if in fact plans are done that really are attempting to safeguard water quality, there may be instances where we get more than the 300 feet that we had wanted originally. On the other hand, we may get significantly less. So I think it's going to remain to be seen how that pans out. And just one other take home from the lesson in Flathead, one of the things that we found was that at the end of the day, it wasn't the science that held up the progress, and it wasn't the science that kept the county commissioners from adopting a numeric standard. At the end of the day, what stopped them was the legal ramifications of setbacks. There is a contingent in Flathead County that is very vocal and kind of touted the takings argument. We didn't mount a response to that. We actually hired an attorney who not only is a land use attorney, but her specialty is setbacks, and in fact worked with the folks, the 4 counties in the Big Hole. But when all was said and done, that rallying cry of takings, I think, had a very large effect. So it is important to educate folks regarding the science, but I think you also have to educate folks regarding the legal aspects of setbacks. Setbacks in and of themselves, as long as there is some kind of a variance provision, is not a takings, plain and simple. It's not. But that doesn't keep the counties from sometimes being scared of that threat. I'd like to close, am I out of time? Okay. I'd like to close, I guess, with a couple of thoughts. The first is that, Jack made a comment regarding being in touch with your federal congressmen and their staffers, and I heartily agree. But right now, the state legislative session is also in full tilt. It's important to be up to speed on what's going on there. There's a lot of things that are on the table right now that will affect water quality, that will affect setbacks potentially. So it's important to be aware of what's going on and to weigh in. And there are some projects that even if they don't seem like they affect water quality right off the bat, will in fact have a great impact on water quality. For example, there's a proposal right now for funding for LIDAR mapping, which would assist us greatly in being able to map those riparian corridors, and that funding is at extreme risk right now. I'll be testifying on that on Monday. So it's important to keep abreast of what's going on and to weigh in. And for those of you who can go to Helena, I will tell you it's a big bang for the buck. Legislators take very seriously your willingness to travel to Helena and testify. It has great sway, so I encourage you, if there is anything that you are concerned about, to go to Helena and make your voice heard. The final thing I want to bring to your attention is there is the Montana River and Stream Protection Act. There is no LC number attached to it right now, and I don't even know if it's out of the House or the Senate. But this would mandate a setback of 20 feet as the minimum starting point. I'm not in a position to advocate one way or another for this proposed bill, but it's probably something you might want to educate yourselves on, and again, weigh in if and when this does in fact get out of committee. Thank you very much for your time.
One small correction from my intro that Bruce gave me is, I don't know where anybody would think I'm from Minnesota, although I'm sure Minnesota's a great place to live and be from. That's okay. I just thought I'd correct it for the record. I'm actually an Army brat who lived in Missoula as a kid and moved back as a young adult, and I've been here well over 30 years, so I consider myself a Missoulian. Hopefully the rest of the people do too. With that said, I want to let everybody know it's truly an honor for me to be here today, and I want to thank Bob Clark and the Sierra Club for holding this conference on such an important topic and for inviting me to participate on a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. I worked in the watershed world for almost 10 years prior to running for being a county commissioner, so something I'm very familiar with, and really had trouble deciding what to talk about here and what to bring into focus. So I'm so glad that it's been well covered by those before me as far as the educational part of things, and I can focus more on the county perspective of things, although I'm going to leave you with a short story that I didn't hear anybody else talk about yet. So I have good news and I have bad news. But I have more good news than I do bad news, so we'll just get the bad news out of the way already, and everybody probably already knows what it is. The bad news is Missoula County does not as yet have any kind of comprehensive plan to deal with stream side setbacks. While our city may, and we have a great planning board who oversees subdivisions and is sensitive to the issue and looks at these as a concern, at this juncture, we don't have any set standards in place to deal with the county when it comes to individual lots. As many people may know, a couple years ago, Missoula County was working on a plan that would have implemented streamside zoning, and it was not met very favorably at the meetings that were held. But from that, the county learned a lot and decided to fall back and go back to the drawing board. They got a lot of public input, and the county does really respect the citizens' involvement and the citizens' comments, as well as property rights. So they've gone back to the drawing board and they put together, and this is where we start getting to the good news, make that clear. They did put together a technical advisory committee. The acronym for that is TAC, T-A-C, with a lot of very wonderful professionals in the field, fisheries biologists, hydrologists, engineers, everything from people from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the Forest Service, the university, other organizations. I think the list is like 16 or 17 people long, and I have it here for when we get to questions if people want to know a lot more about it. So they've been working now for over a year on putting together the various information about the streams, because the county realized they didn't know everything they needed to know in order to implement streamside setbacks. There's a lot of science behind it, and not all streams are created equal or share the same dynamics. While they may have similarities, they're not the same. So this technical advisory committee has been working on putting all the various information together regarding the hydrology, the soils, the aspects, the elevation, all of these things together, and are creating a matrix and then are rating it. And they're done with that process as of December, I believe, and it's on the county's website under rural initiatives. You can get to it. All their minutes are there and the matrix that they've put together. And from there, the technical advisory committee will be working with a citizens advisory committee that will be being put together. Although the website said they're working on putting it together, they're not quite there yet. And then from there, they'll be putting everybody's ideas and the science together to really implement something that everyone can live with, or at least most people can live with, because we realize that there are economic benefits, there are environmental benefits to preserving and protecting the riparian zones and the streams. So I want to make that perfectly clear that while things take a long time sometimes to get through the bureaucratic channels, we're not trying to force anything down anybody's throats. We're trying to do this in as much of a responsible manner, both to the public and to the environment as we possibly can, because we realize the sensitive issues all the way around on this. Now, for a small story about the food chain, everybody did a great job of talking about the different aspects of what's important with the riparian zones, everything from the migration corridors, the shade, the temperature, and all these other benefits. But there's this little story that when I was educating the youngsters, both the youngsters and the parents that were along on the field trips really appreciated that, and that's that food web chain. So you think that leaves look kind of messy when they're falling on the ground. I know I always hated fall because it's like, oh, it's so messy. They fall in the rivers and they float downstream. But what you don't realize is those leaves actually are a food source for the aquatic invertebrate bugs that live in the stream. And the bugs eat the last of the chlorophyll that's in the leaf. And then the fish eat the bugs, and then other animals eat the fish, and people eat the fish as well. So, you don't think of something as simple as a leaf on a tree as actually being such a big part of the food source for those critters that live in the stream and out of the stream. So I just want to leave you with that today. I'm short and brief and to the point because I think it's more important looking at the different people here today and prepared to answer a lot of questions, but I'm more concerned with what your questions are than what information I have. And I think you've gotten a pretty good comprehensive idea of why the stream sides are so important and all the other dynamics that go with it, the riprap, everything that I can think of to cover has been covered here, and I just don't see the sense in belaboring the point, but I'm very much interested in what everybody else has to say in the way of questions. Thank you.
Well, go ahead and steer the questioning here. Do we have any? Speakers were great, by the way.
Can I just talk really loud? I just didn't know what they had. I just didn't know because I'm unclear as to, I don't the bureaucratic tape that goes into all of this about do counties is there an official way that counties get together and where these things are discussed instead of or is it just county by county? And if not, why not? And how can that be put into effect? Because to me, it's the communication process, and that seems to be lacking really, in this field right now. You know what I mean? Because if you're going to have the education out there, you're so good at educating people. I mean, it's the city hall meetings. I mean, they have these pinpoint presentations. Because we're such a visual society, they need that. And if they don't have that, if things are only being discussed on that level, then nothing ever gets done. It's just, do you know what I mean? To look at things from a bigger picture and getting all those counties together, it just would be great.
That's a good question. We do. communicate with one another. We don't always agree with each other, and there's some differences there's sort of this, it's been written about a lot by individuals, Code of the West, and in different regions, kind of different people are attracted to those regions. So each region sort of has a unwritten specific Code of the West to that region. So we do have that we have to consider when we look at personal property rights. But there is an organization called Montana Association of Counties, the acronym for that. I live in the acronym world now, MACO, and there's a national one as well, and there's publications that go out, as well as communications. Anytime a county official wants or needs to, you can contact any one of these. And so there is good dialogue going on, and Missoula County in particular is working and communicating regularly on a number of issues with Ravalli, Lake, Granite, and one other one I can't think of off the top of my head. So Missoula County is trying to be pretty proactive on a number of issues with talking to other counties. You're welcome.
This gentleman. Oh, hold up. Here we go. Hold up, Dan.
Basically, all the counties in Montana were supposed to have a land use plan in 1970. I was wondering why Missoula County is taking them so long to get one.
I think that's for you, Michelle. Although you're so new at your position, I don't know that
I do, but we do have a growth policy, and it's been in place, and it's just coming due to start looking at it again pretty soon. And they've already started sort of looking at it and reviewing it in-house, and some of the aspects are still good and golden. Some aspects will need to go back to the citizens to see if we've reached our objectives and goals and how we've changed and what things we may need to add, delete, etc. So we do have a growth policy in Missoula County.
Any more questions? Dan?
I had two questions. Well, first one, I was in Australia, and I would notice there they would do a lot of corridors between streams and all that, with a lot of the water plants and all that sort of stuff. Doesn't necessarily have to dig a hole, but more just what because that way the wildlife would have a longer area to run around it. And I wonder if we do that here that much. I haven't seen. And then the second question is that it seems to me that a lot of people want to build a place, by the stream, and the local conditions, the local government is not really that appropriate, and so they'll put it in and let it go as they want, and it seems to me that as pressure gets more and more with water and so forth, water and global warming, that we need to really crack down. But it's the local government here in Montana and many places can get away with what they want when they want to put something in.
So was your question on whether we have more corridor, or we could create corridors for? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in Australia they actually have a lot of the opposite problems with their water than we do in the western United States, where they have channelized and built up their rivers so much for irrigation delivery of water that they don't get any of the floodplain values anymore. Their rivers aren't allowed to flood. So there's plenty of water in the streams and rivers, whereas in Montana, as Jack mentioned, a lot of ours are dewatered because we take water out and they actually keep the water in. So they are trying to mitigate all the loss to their riparian areas and floodplain habitat by actually creating, like you're saying, creating these false wetlands and trying to get water out of the rivers and streams at opportune times. And as Karen said, we're lucky in Montana that we still have we have a lot of intact riparian habitat here. So if we can protect our existing habitat, we don't have to create new water, getting water out of the streams for our banks. As for the second question, that's a tough one. Was your question about why local, basically,
Otherwise, pretty much they put the places by our streams they want to.
yeah.
And get away with all kinds of stuff when we really can't crack down on them.
For subdivision review, we can, and we are. And our planning board is doing a very good job at the education part of educating people as to why we can and can't do things and why things are good and bad is just daunting. You'll be happy to know that and I forgot to mention this, that even the Missoula County Realtors put together their own technical advisory committee after doing a float trip down the rivers, and remarkably, this may surprise some, they were very much on the same page as our technical advisors, and they understand the importance of not building right up on the streams. It was a very enlightening experience for them. They put together a very well thought out statement and sent it to the county, letting us know that what they learned by it and so on. So I think we're getting there. We have to weigh certain balances of property rights, and we have to go about this doing the right thing. Where we really don't have a lot of say right now is on individuals who just own a lot. So subdivisions are being looked at, they're scrutinized very carefully these days, but individual lot owners or acreage owners are not. Although the health department and DEQ does regulate where they can put their septic systems and their wells for health purposes, nobody is overseeing where they can actually put their home site or ground source heat pumps and so on like that. And I am working on a kinder and gentler plan to try to bring that to fruition while we continue to work on these technical things that I think may help bring that into being. Hope that helps and answers your question.
Hi, this is a question for Michelle or
Hold
Karen.
on, if I could just add one thing. To go back to your question about the corridors, the Western Governors Association actually signed the corridor initiative in their last conference session, and this session they will discuss how that actually could be implemented. It's not specific only and solely to riparian corridors, but in fact it could include riparian corridors as well. So at the state level and at the regional level, there is an opportunity to do more corridor preservation.
Can I go? Okay. This is a question for Michelle or Karen. You know, since individual property rights seem to kind of be the focus or the real strength, and sometimes that tends to kind of foster the tragedy of the commons, continue that. Are there any kind of accreditation programs that you guys can talk about that may give incentives for people, private owners, of doing setbacks along streams and kind of helping improve the riparian areas?
When you say accreditation, do you mean something like the LEED
Programs such as rebates or kind of tax breaks or any kind of
Incentives?
Oh, incentives. I know in Flathead, actually, they recently spoke about doing just that, to give some kind of property tax incentives to ag folks who are willing to do setbacks and perhaps even restoration work along the stream banks. I don't know what they have in Missoula County. Also, there are programs, I mean, in Yellowstone, the Yellowstone Business Council, just established recently, and it's based on the LEED accreditation program, a sustainable rating program for development. And I know a lot of the counties across the state are looking at doing similar things. I know it's something that we're considering working on.
I can say, yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely the sort of flipping the argument, because it's a great mindset to say, how can we reward the people who are doing the things the right way, or the way that helps everyone else. And so, like the Missoula Water Quality District, for folks hooking up to sewers from septic systems, have a rebate program, and that's a great incentive. Again, it takes money, and funds are always limited for these things, but some sort of a rebate would be great. And we're also looking at some sort of accreditation for developers or surveyors, so that they so that they have this is what they were doing like in McCall, Idaho, I think I mentioned, so that they are in and of themselves certified as a, riparian best management practice builder or surveyor or developer or whatever it might be.
Hey Brianna, the conservation districts have a grant program for restoration. I mean, they give funding away for restoration projects every year. It's under the 310 program, and
Yep.
they actually give funding away. It's a competitive grant program.
And thanks Beth, that's great. Actually through the conservation districts too, I meant to mention this in my talk, there's a really cool, I don't know if the commission, I know Flathead, somewhere in Flathead, there's a cool coalition right now of counties and conservation districts and water quality districts that are all partnering for a really hard-hitting riparian vegetation outreach campaign. Missoula Water Quality District, you guys might have seen the ads in the paper this last spring. They had the cute little names on cottonwoods, and basically 319 money came through from the EPA, and they're funding a whole Western Montana-wide outreach campaign this May and June, and all the high-growth county areas are going to try to do more of the outreach of this is why it's an incentive to protect our riparian vegetation.
Do you have any thoughts about restricting the application of pesticides in riparian areas or setback areas?
We absolutely recognize the importance of that. That has been discussed. Hopefully anybody that's using those things realizes that. I know when they go for assistance with the weed district, they have to map their property and they have to follow the regulations of what's recommended and what's not. You really don't want to get me going on pesticides. I have a big soapbox I get on with pesticides. I have a problem with even the stores selling the stuff for people to kill the bugs in the lawn because things eat the bugs. So I need to pass on this at this time because I'll get on my soapbox about pesticides.
I mean, we're trying to get that in ordinance language for sure in these counties, but we'll see what happens when it all shakes out.
I think also if you can maintain a native buffer, there'll be a lot less call for using pesticides, and hopefully a lot less of it will be going into the waterways. The other thing is we've worked with cherry growers on the Flathead to actually implement a program where, not that we have done it, we've supported a program whereby they educate cherry growers as to the proper use of pesticides and herbicides so that they're using the correct amount. One of the other problems with the use of a lot of these chemicals is that they're overused and they're overapplied, so you get a lot of runoff in rain events. Whereas if you apply the correct amount, it goes into the soil, and hopefully there's a lot less leaching and overland flow. So those are a couple things to also consider.
I think Sterling has a question here next.
Yeah, I've been thinking about Bruce's example about this guy that billed 3 times on the big hole and how to address that kind of issue. First of all, I know in Missoula County, but I don't know whether or not statewide there's a law against riprapping. There's not a statewide, that's a county provision, but you can't just go out and riprap in Missoula County, can you? But that's one question.
Do you have?
But, yeah. All right, that's one question, and the other part of the question that I was getting at is to clarify what the law is and how you can get that enforced and permitted. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, it occurs to me that one way to get around this property rights issue is perhaps by insurance. If people like, this guy Bruce was talking about couldn't get insurance to rebuild, that would be a strong disincentive to allow people to, to build next to the, in these riparian corridors and in these floodplains. And it would be a way of not removing the property rights, but just preventing the building through that mechanism by not allowing them to get insurance. So that's an observation.
Well, that's an interesting concept regarding the insurance. But as far as the riprap goes in Missoula County, we strengthened our floodplain regulations. So now, if you do want to use that kind of hard armor technique, you have to go through a variance project as well with the county, but you still have to go through all the other hoops with the conservation district and depending on what the stream is, if it's considered a navigable stream, the Army Corps of Engineers and the DNRC has to weigh in on it, and then the county commissioners, and it's really unfortunate that it broke all our hearts, actually, that we had to grant a variance just recently because the guy did have a permit to build his house. He did get the permit to put in the septic and drain field, and the health department told him where he could put those things. And he put in a ground source heat pump for his heating. And so because we allowed him these permits, and last year when the high water event came, which was really just a natural runoff season for Lolo Creek, it washed out about 20 feet of his property and was endangering a very expensive ground source heat pump system that he put in. And it was painful to grant the variance because he met all the criterias and jumped through all the hoops, and all the other agencies approved it. And I felt as though because we didn't have the other mechanisms in place, more of a comprehensive streamside setback program, we would essentially be remiss in not allowing this person to protect his investment. So I definitely advocate for a more comprehensive program along those means, but I'm also very sensitive to private property rights. How many people in this room own private property? How many people in this room like being told what to do by the government? I'm not seeing a lot of hands jump up there. How would everybody in this room like it if we mandated that to save the world and our global warming and climate change, that we were going to mandate everybody put in green roofs and different kinds of water systems and heat systems and only be allowed to drive so many days a week? So no, none of us really like I would like a lot of those things too, but you know, the fact of the matter is we do have personal property rights that we have to be respectful of. And government can go too far and sometimes not far enough, and we need to find the appropriate balance, and I'm confident that we will.
Hi, yes, my question is, are there any counties that exist within the United States that are doing it right, that we can use and hold up as a model? And I have a second question regarding the wilderness bill. There was an article here about how we were left out as a state. Is there anything on the books in the system currently with regard to the bill?
Bruce, that's your question.
I don't know about the bill, but I do, as far as a county that's doing it right, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Methow County in Washington is doing it right. They've put out a Good Neighbor handbook. They've got all the rules and regulations in place. It's a handbook that I actually presented to some of the people, county commissioners and others that were at one of our admin meetings, and it's a model that I'm really working towards for Missoula County. Everything's in there, from ridgetop building to why you can burn, what you can burn, when you can burn, to streamside setbacks, and it's done very beautifully. So check it out, Methow County, Washington.
I don't know if I could cite any county that's, quote, doing it right 100%, but I can cite a number of counties in Montana that are doing it better than our local counties. And the issue of private property rights was easily addressed. Gallatin County is doing it much better than Missoula County is. Choteau County, that's C-H-O-U-T-A-U, Choteau County, very rural area in Montana. At the 4 counties on the Big Hole, I mean, we've got to start. It's something that's much better. We've created some incentives down there for people to do it differently, regulatory incentive, unfortunately, but it really hasn't been the end of the world for people.
my experience, and I've been working on the setback stuff, all 3 legislative sessions that helped write the bills have been working on it. With the exception of Gallatin County, there's just one thing, that's very obvious, is that the opportunity to get a setback is inverse to the amount of realtors and developers you have in that county. And it's really interesting that the most conservative counties, some of the most conservative counties that we have in the state, Madison County, for example, where we, by the way, have a very large setback, 500 feet for the Madison River, for most uses. Some of the most conservative counties with most conservative people relative to property rights are some of the most progressive when it comes to stream corridor protection from new development. So all the rules and all the myths out there about who supports what, who doesn't support what things like setbacks do and do not do really don't apply here. People really love the rivers, and you'd be surprised at who they are and what they're willing to give up.
Any more questions?
I have a question about not only the, what are those things, the pesticides that we were talking about. I live in one of the, I will not name it, but I am part of a homeowners association that says that I must keep my lawn and my house up to snuff. And I think that some of the people who live in my neighborhood are absolutely nuts. They think that we live in Scotland. And so they think that they're, you know, it has to be Kelly Green all year round, and they just throw so much of that junk, I think full of nitrites and all that sort of thing. And so I'm thinking about working on getting a grant to do some studies on how that affects our local water. But so before I do that, I could ask you, do you think that this stuff really is harmful? You know, am I just getting on my high horse about something I should not do? Or is all that stuff to keep your grass green a problem?
You got Michelle now.
Yeah, I think it's really harmful. If you, and the health department does have some information there regarding green lawns, and that there was a movement afoot about a year or 2 ago, and I can't remember the name of it, but I know Marchie's Nursery, not plugging anybody, but I know they have some information on it. And if you properly aerate your lawns, water them, they'll get the water and the nutrients they need. You'll have thick roots for your grasses, and your grasses will outcompete the weeds. And we need the bugs, we need a certain amount of organic matter in our lawns to do what it is they do in providing nourishment and so on. So there's a whole little booklet on it at the health department, I believe, that talks about how to keep your lawns green, and you only need to water them every couple days. You only need, I think, an inch or 2 every couple days, and if you do it right, you don't need any of those pesticides or herbicides.
You answered that very well. Main thing is too many people like to overdo it. They just follow the regulations, they'll do it right.
It's not against the bugs, I think. They're just trying to get as much nitrogen as they can to keep the grass green.
And the organic matter will do that. So you know, if you don't catch your leaves or your grass clippings, at least not every time. Your lawn needs a certain amount of that mulch in there. And in the fall, if you just chop up the leaves and put it back into the lawn, that helps create the organic matter and the nitrogen to feed your lawn. And it will get a lot of nutrients just from the water as well. So, and bugs that live and die, they create fertilizer. You know, you can have a natural, beautiful, thick, healthy, green, lush lawn without any of that stuff.
I have a nice green lawn and I don't use chemicals, but exactly what Michelle was saying, and aerating it is really important, and watering it pretty heavily, but not too often is what I've learned. And I got the pamphlet that she's talking about, and it's very helpful. It can show you exactly what to do to get that green lawn without the chemicals. Any other questions for our panelists? If there isn't, we're about 15 minutes early, and I'll, wow, that's really weird. That's not Missoula-like. I did want to mention, though, a couple of things before we broke. First of what I want to do is to give a round of hand for Bruce for facilitating and all three of our panel members. And I'd like to remind folks that we have sign-in sheets on clipboards in the back, and if you haven't taken the opportunity to sign in, we will not sell your email or sell your name, but we would like to capture the folks that are interested in the things that we've been talking about so that we can keep you informed on what we're doing locally here in Missoula and in the state. So I encourage you to at least sign in on the sheet if you can. And then secondly, a couple of the speakers have talked about engaging the decision makers, whether it be the state legislature or our congressional delegation. And to that end, the Sierra Club actually has a lobby day on January 30th, where we take a full day and bring citizens out to Helena. We do a half a day of a short training, and then for the second half of the day, we go to the Capitol and people can engage their legislators. They can testify at a hearing, they can sit in on a hearing. It's a very empowering experience. We've done it the last 3 or 4 sessions of the state legislature, and we usually get between 10 to 20 people come out, and we will buy lunch and provide transportation from Missoula to there. All you need to do is take a Friday off and head out to Helena with us, and we rent a van. We'll pay for the lunch. We have great person, Ann Hedges, who is extremely experienced in the state legislature, that will give a short training. So you'll be all prepared, we'll be dressed professionally, and then we move on to the Capitol to engage our legislators. It's a uniquely empowering experience, and the access that we have to our legislators in Montana is incredible, to be able to do that and to actually meet with your legislator, talk with them about certain bills. So if you're interested in that, let me know. And I will give you my business card, and you can send me an email, and I'll put you on our list for January 30th. It's a Friday. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out a little bit early, which is really unprecedented for Missoula. We'll take it, won't we, Paul? And I wanted to, again, just thank everyone for coming out, and please stay involved. Thanks.